On July 30th, the world marked the World Day Against Trafficking in Persons. On the Altos set today, we have Kimoy Thomas, the Deputy Director of the Counter Trafficking Unit. Kimoy, tell us, what is human trafficking?
Okay, thank you for having me on the program. Firstly, human trafficking is actually a modern form of slavery. And when I say that, it's because persons, they tend to find themselves in situations where they are being exploited, either because someone forced them to do it or deceived them, or someone actually paid another person for that person to be exploited. Human trafficking in Trinidad and Tobago could take several forms. We have sexual trafficking, which is where persons are forced to provide sexual services against their will. We have labor trafficking, where persons are working for very long hours, they're not being paid, they can't communicate with their families. We have domestic servitude, which is happening in the gated community. So sometimes you might see your neighbor with a person cleaning the house, but that person is not going out. Or if you say good morning to the person is afraid to make eye contact with you. So those are the types of human trafficking that we have going on in Trinidad.
But tell me, this sounds very serious, but how bad is the problem in Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, the problem is bad in Trinidad because we actually have victims here. So once you have one victim of human trafficking where someone's human rights are being so grossly violated, it is a problem for the country. Given the fact that we are so close to Venezuela, and because of the situation in Venezuela right now, what we've seen is a lot of Venezuelans entering our country illegally. And because of their vulnerabilities, because remember, they don't have identity documents, they can't speak the language, they are here illegally, persons can take advantage of them, which is happening because there are some women who are being forced to provide sexual services, and then there are men who they have families to take care of. So if someone would usually pay, let's say a painter, $500 a day to paint, they would pay the Venezuelan $50 a day. So we have that type of exploitation going on. And what's more is that a lot of our young persons, Trinidad and Tobago citizens, they spend so much time on social media and they're engaging with persons that they don't even know. So for example, sometimes I go to schools, primary and secondary schools, and the children admit to speaking to persons that they don't know, and sometimes they say these persons ask them to send them nude pictures or ask them a lot of questions about are you home alone, you know, where are your parents? So all of these things are contributing to human trafficking and making it a problem in Trinidad.
But as a community then, what are the signs we should be looking out for? You mentioned, for instance, someone working in somebody else's property, but not willing to make eye contact.
Correct.
What are the other signs we could look for that would scream
human trafficking?
Human trafficking.
Right. So, well, in the case of sex trafficking, what you could look for is sometimes you see the woman, they tend to live in a very small apartment together. So you might see 10 to 15 women in one bedroom apartment. You would notice that it's only a particular car taking them out. They're not free to go out. Sometimes the situation is so bad there might be a padlock on the gate and only one person could open it. They tend to be very fearful of law enforcement. So if you are in the presence of a police officer or an immigration officer, you notice they divert or go a different direction. With regard to the labor exploitation with the men, they tend to live where they are working. So if you go to, like, let's say a grocery or a hardware store, you might notice there are persons living on the compound as well. So those are signs as well of very young children working in restaurants and groceries, because children under the age of 16 are not supposed to be working in Trinidad and Tobago, and that is something that we are seeing as well with both local children and migrants.
So recently, for instance, I had the experience of driving by the UE, the traffic lights by UE, and I saw two young guys, clearly underage, minors, and they were wiping, you know, people's windshields. Would that be a form of, or could that be a form of exploitation of human trafficking?
Yes, it could amount to child labor as opposed to human trafficking. So it's two different crimes. Yeah, child labor is where a child is working under the age of 16, so they're not being allowed to attend school, they don't have any recreation and things like that. But it turns into human trafficking where the child's life is at risk. So for example, children who might be working in the mines or in a lab or among toxic substances, that is where the human trafficking element will come into play.
This is a Catholic program. This is Altos, is Catholic news. What role can the Catholic Church play? What role, to the best of your knowledge, is the Catholic Church in Trinidad and Tobago playing as a foil against human trafficking?
Well, definitely the Catholic Church has to continue supporting the vulnerable communities, and by vulnerable I mean not just the migrants but also our locals as well, who may be unemployed or victims of domestic violence. So just that support by having food drives, clothing drives, these things would help persons to be less vulnerable to be exploited. Because remember, when persons don't have food and they have their children and they see their children wanting food, they'll be willing to do any and everything.
Easy trigger.
Right? Another thing the Catholic Church and NGOs could do is also partner with like the CTU, so we could reach out to the migrant community to sensitize them on human trafficking, on how to protect themselves, how to know who's a potential trafficker so that they'd avoid such persons. They also have to have sessions with men because, you know, the demand for sex in Trinidad is relatively high. So by sensitizing men to the dangers of paying for sex and the impact that it could have on these women is something also that the Catholic Church could get involved in. And also having activities for young persons as well to keep them out of vulnerable situations, because young persons, when they don't have anything to do on the afternoons, on the weekends, that is when they tend to get themselves into trouble.
The devil always finds work for idle hands.
Exactly. So that is where the Catholic Church could assist.
Now, Kimoy, you mentioned Venezuelans. The Venezuelans in Trinidad and Tobago the only ones being trafficked?
No, they are the largest group of persons being trafficked at this point in time because of the proximity. But we also have victims from India, we have from Guyana as well as Kenya. But those, you tend to find them being more victims of labor trafficking.
Labor trafficking, because very often you go to some of the establishments and you hear persons with Caribbean accents, Jamaicans, for instance, working as security officers in various places.
So with regard to those persons now, we've had no reports to date of them being victims, and that is why sensitization and even taking part in programs like this is so important to get the word out there. So sometimes somebody might be watching the program and say, but wait, I know somebody who is, you know, facing a situation like that, they're not being paid, or they're being beaten or threatened if it is they refuse to work. So maybe let me contact the CTU or make a report to the police station.
And now that Venezuelans can, in fact, access Trinidad and Tobago legally, they can be granted a visa to come to Trinidad. Is the problem as bad today as it was, let's say, 2 years, 3 years ago when this was not possible?
So at present, we don't have the necessary reports or statistics to be able to do a proper comparison between it. But just because they have a visa to come in, it doesn't make it less likely that they could become victims. Yeah, because that is something else as well. Persons tend to mix up smuggling and human trafficking. I'm just bringing in the smuggling here because, you know, some persons, they pay to enter into the country illegally, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're a victim. The victimization only comes into play if they're exploited. Similarly, if someone enters into the country legally but with a visa, it doesn't mean that they won't be exploited, because, for example, a family member might say, okay, come and stay with me for 3 months, you know, and you could work and go back with money, and when they come here, they find themselves working and not being paid or being forced to provide sexual services.
Tell me something, which of these 3 challenges, prevention, protection, or prosecution, which of those 3 challenges is proving the most difficult for the CTU, and why?
Okay, well, the CTU, we as a unit have been working assiduously with all 3, the prevention, protection, and prosecution. But to date, the most challenging one would definitely be prosecution, because, you know, to date we have had no convictions, but we are taking a lot of steps to fix that. So, for example, we've been initiating joint training between the police, the judiciary, as well as the state prosecutors. You know, we are reviewing the Trafficking in Persons Act to make some of the offences hybrid, and also with the recent passage of the Administration of Justice Indictable Proceedings Act, that is expected to fast-track some of the human trafficking cases as well. So we're on the right path to getting successful prosecution.
Ms. Thomas, I want to thank you so very much for joining us on Altos. It's been a pleasure chatting with you, and I'm sure over as the months and years roll by, we will be hearing more from the Counter Trafficking Unit.
Thank you so much for having me. Yes,
you're very welcome.